Hi, I'm David Judson, Editor-in-Chief of Stratfor. With me today is George Friedman, Stratfor's founder and chairman. Thank you for making some time, George.
Pleasure.
We've had a lot of internal discussions now about what's coming around the corner. Can you give us a glimpse ahead? I was really intrigued by a remark you made in one of the memos floating about here that China is not going to drive American policy. The Middle East is not going to drive American policy. Europe will be at the center of the policy agenda in the near future. Can you amplify that? That's kind of provocative.
I'd put it a little differently.
Yeah.
American policy will be driven by what today's news is.
Right.
History is going to be driven by Europe. It is still, taken all together, the most prosperous place on earth. It is historically filled with ties to the third world and everything else. And it's in a terrific crisis, an economic crisis that's turned into a social crisis and is becoming a political crisis. The crisis economically is its inability to find a solution to what happened to it after 2008. The social crisis is that one part of Europe, Germany and Austria, is doing relatively well. Southern Europe is in a catastrophic position. And the political crisis is that there's been a tremendous decline in trust in the EU, and not only in the EU, but in the European elite. To the bureaucrats who have believed so deeply in this project, there are opponents emerging, and that opens the door to the possibility of the reemergence of real European nationalism, of which we see signs. And when Europe gets nationalistic, the world gets nervous.
Well, I mean, in the piece you wrote last week about the fall of the Berlin Wall, you spent a lot of time talking about, the collapse not of the wall, but of Marxism, of the new left ideologies that really dominated your youth and mine in the 1960s and 1970s. The interesting thing in Europe is that, while the right is evolving and doing its own thing, the left, if we want to call it that, is really echoes back to the 1970s. There's a new political party in Spain, Podemos, calling for minimum income and a lot of ideas that would have made sense in the 1970s. But the contest is really between the sort of center-right and this populist far-right, it seems to me. Is that too extreme an assessment?
I don't think so. I mean, when we go back to the 1920s, the last time we had this sort of massive economic social dysfunction, the communists outside of the Soviet Union were certainly active. But the real power emerged in the hands of Mussolini and Hitler and other really right-wing regimes. There is a strand in European life that is anti-modern, that is highly nationalist, and that is also racist to some extent. And in bad times, the strand emerges. The European left, divided between the intellectuals and the workers and so on, never quite coalesced into something that could, as Lenin did, seize control of Europe. So when we look at these crises, there's a historical precedence for what we're seeing, which is the emergence of the far right.
How far do you want to go out in predicting the dynamics of the far right? I mean, there's some pretty disturbing things going on. Is it going to get as nasty as the 1930s or thereafter?
We first have to face two things. This situation is unsustainable.
Right.
And the Europeans have no solution for it. So it's not as if we're just going to wait and it's going to work itself out. Different countries, not just Greece, but France and Germany are deeply at odds over matters of fundamental national interest on how to proceed within this context. In that sense, the nation states are now the major vehicle of Europe, not the European Union. In some cases, it's benign, like France at this moment. Hollande is pursuing the interests of France. But beneath the surface, even there, is the National Front of Marine Le Pen, and in other countries, hard right-wing groups. So I would argue that the European Union is failing. What naturally reemerges is the nation state that never really went away. And the real question we have is, leading the resurgence of the nation state, are you going to have centrist rightist parties, or are you going to have hard rightist parties? And that's really going to depend in part on how Germany and the European Union respond to this process. If they become assertive, if they become aggressive to maintain the status quo, it'll get nastier.
Well, I mean, we just came off the G20 where there's talk of too big to fail and reforms of the banking system. But any thoughts on that? Because there's been there's an interesting sort of sub debate going on about the prescription being given for what ails Europe actually being a tonic that could kill the patient.
Well, the problem here is that 6 years ago, we had a banking crisis. And from the standpoint of the European leadership and from the standpoint of many of the financial community, that's still the fundamental question. At a time when Spain has 25% unemployment, this is sort of like putting a Band-Aid in the hemorrhage. And this is the real problem of the EU. It knows how to engage a banking crisis now. It doesn't know how to deal with a social calamity. And so the G20 thing is a symptom of the underlying problem. Certainly the banking issue is fundamental, but so long as this unemployment continues, the banking system can never be truly stable because the demand for goods from Germany that exports 50% of its GDP can't be filled. You can't solve the problem so long as you have numbers like you're seeing in Southern Europe.
Okay, well, on that cheerful note, let me quickly pivot to the BRICs, because we've been talking about the problems in China's transition and it's struggling to reinvent its economy. We've recently seen Russia struggling, particularly with the price of oil. Now we see some signs of turmoil in Brazil. So that leaves the BRICs with India as we go from BRICs to I. Any thoughts on how that's going to play out in the international system here?
Well, for a temporary period, the BRICs, which have nothing in common but a cool name, were dynamic powers in the international economic scene. These things always pass. Japan was once the dynamic power in the international scene. So the real question is, what do they return to? China appears to be returning to lower growth and a dictatorship to contain blows. Russia is obviously dealing with the problem that it has. It's a one-trick show. It's got energy, and if its prices go down, they're in trouble. Brazil is having a cyclical downturn that, because of mismanagement, could well turn into a long-term downturn. So what countries are going to emerge to replace them? And, we've talked at Stratfor about the post-China 16, which are 16 countries amalgamated that show signs of growing. But beyond that, this much is clear. Europe is in deep crisis.
Right.
The BRIC countries are no longer performing the way they are. For better or worse, the only country that is showing signs of improvement is the United States. And that is, I think, the most important thing to take away from this conversation. Right. As dumb and stupid and weird as the United States is, it's the one that's growing the fastest.
Right.
It's the one that has developing the lowest unemployment.
Well, some people can take hope from that, and some will not. In either event, join us here at Stratfor to follow up on this. Thank you very much. Thank you, George.